2 days after her confrontation with Grayson, Isla woke with a strange sense of calm. Not the fragile calm that comes from pretending everything is fine, but the deep, steady kind that comes from knowing you've taken back control. For the first time in years, she wasn't afraid of what he might say or do. She knew he could still try to strike back, but the difference now was that she had the power to meet him head-on and win. That morning, she called her best friend Lila, who had been quietly cheering her on from the sidelines since the divorce. "I need a day," Ela said. "A day for me. No work, no meetings, just transformation." Lila didn't even hesitate. "I'm in. Where do we start?" They started at the salon, the same place Ela had gone years ago, but this time she wasn't asking for something Grayson would like. She told the stylist she wanted sharp, confident, and unapologetic. The stylist grinned and set to work, trimming her hair into a sleek, modern cut that framed her face and made her green eyes stand out even more. From there, they went to a boutique Lila swore by, one that specialized in bold statement pieces. Ela tried on everything from tailored power suits to flowing silk dresses. She chose clothes that made her feel unstoppable: a black velvet blazer with gold buttons, a cream silk blouse that caught the light, wide-leg trousers that moved with every step like she was walking a runway. It wasn't about looking rich, it was about looking like a woman who knew exactly who she was. By afternoon, they were at a spa, where Isla let herself truly relax for the first time in weeks. She sat in the steam room, eyes closed, breathing in eucalyptus, letting the tension melt from her shoulders. For so long she'd been carrying the weight of other people's expectations, and now she was finally setting it down. When she stepped out, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Ethan. "Dinner tonight? I want to see you." She smiled to herself. "Pick me up at 8. That evening when Ethan arrived, Ela was ready. She stepped out of her apartment in the black velvet blazer and silk blouse, her new haircut shining under the city lights. Ethan's eyes swept over her, and for a moment he didn't say anything. Finally he smiled. "You look dangerous." "In a good way?" she asked. "In the best way." They went to a rooftop restaurant with a view of the skyline, the kind of place where every table seemed to glow in candlelight. As they sipped wine, Ethan asked, "So what's next? You've faced him, you've got the leverage. What do you want to do now?" Isla thought about it. "I want to make sure he can't twist the narrative anymore. I'm done playing defense. I want to tell my story, on my terms." Ethan nodded. "Then we'll make it happen. There's a charity gala next month, the Children's Foundation. You'd be a perfect keynote speaker." She laughed. "Me? Give a speech? Why not? You've got the story, the presence, and the heart. And trust me, the right people will be listening." She hesitated only for a moment before nodding. "All right, let's do it." Over the next few weeks, Isla threw herself into preparation. She worked with a speaking coach to refine her message, not as a woman scorned, but as a professional and a survivor who had rebuilt her life. She told the coach she didn't want pity, she wanted inspiration. In between sessions, she took on new design projects, ones that challenged her creatively and gave her the chance to work with clients she respected. Every day, she felt herself standing taller, speaking with more certainty, smiling without the shadow of old doubts. One afternoon, as she was finalizing a design board in her studio, Lila stopped by. "You're glowing," Lila said. "It's like you've leveled up." "I think I have," Ela said, smiling. "For so long I thought confidence was about proving something to other people. But it's really about proving it to yourself first." The night of the Children's Foundation Gala arrived faster than she expected. The venue was grand but warm, the kind of place that invited connection rather than competition. Ela arrived in a deep sapphire gown that shimmered like the night sky, paired with understated diamond earrings. Ethan was at her side, his pride in her obvious without him saying a word. Backstage, as the organizer handed her a microphone, Isla took a deep breath. This wasn't about Grayson anymore. It wasn't even about Ethan. This was about her, and the countless women who might be sitting in the audience, doubting their worth the way she once had. When she stepped onto the stage, the applause was polite at first, but as she began to speak, the room grew still. She told them about growing up in Queens, about building a career from scratch, about losing herself in a marriage that looked perfect from the outside. She didn't name Grayson, but she didn't need to. The story was clear enough. Then she told them about rebuilding, about finding her own voice again, about learning that self-worth doesn't come from someone else's validation. Her voice never wavered, even when her eyes met Grayson's across the room. Yes, he was there, seated with Serafina, his expression unreadable. When she finished, the applause wasn't polite this time. It was thunderous. People stood, clapping, some even wiping away tears. Back at her table, Ethan leaned in. "You didn't just speak, you owned that stage." She smiled, feeling lighter than she had in years. "I think I finally owned my life." And as she glanced around the room, she realized something else. The power Grayson once had over her was gone. Completely. Because this time, she wasn't just surviving, she was leading. And there was no going back. The Children's Foundation Gala had ended with Isla's standing ovation, but for her, the night wasn't over. She'd noticed Grayson slipping out early, avoiding the post-event mingling. That told her two things. He was rattled, and he didn't want to face her in the afterglow of her success. But the real opportunity would come 2 weeks later, at the Midtown Property Developers Annual Summit, an event Grayson never missed. It was where industry leaders announced major projects, pitched investors, and cemented reputations. Isla hadn't attended since the divorce. She'd been just the wife back then, smiling quietly while Grayson did the talking. This time she was coming as a keynote presenter for a new philanthropic housing initiative backed by Cross Global. When she arrived at the summit, the atmosphere was charged. The venue's ballroom buzzed with investors, developers, and media crews. Large banners displayed logos of the city's biggest real estate firms. On one side of the room, a sleek exhibition booth displayed Cross Global's new projects, front and center. Ethan greeted her at the entrance, offering his arm. "Ready to make history?" he asked with a smirk. "Ready to make him regret ever underestimating me," she replied. They walked in together, drawing more than a few curious glances. The press cameras tracked their entrance, and within minutes, Isla could feel the whispers starting again. This time, though, the whispers weren't questioning her. They were anticipating what she might do. Grayson was at the far end of the room, talking to a group of potential investors. He looked sharp in a navy suit, but there was a tightness around his eyes that hadn't been there before. When he saw Isla approaching, his smile froze for a fraction of a second before he covered it with a professional nod. "Isla," he said smoothly, "didn't expect to see you here." "I'm a keynote speaker," she said evenly. "Ethan's company is sponsoring the affordable housing panel." A flicker of surprise crossed his face. "Impressive, though I suppose Cross Global can get anyone on stage if they write a big enough check." She smiled faintly. "Or maybe they just believe in the work I'm doing." Before he could respond, an event coordinator appeared to usher Isla and Ethan toward the VIP lounge. But not before she caught the way Grayson's gaze followed her, sharp and calculating. The summit's program rolled forward quickly. Networking sessions, presentations, and finally, the keynote block. Isla's slot was right after Grayson's. She took her seat in the front row as he walked up to the stage. Grayson launched into his pitch for a new luxury high-rise project. His voice was smooth, his presentation polished. But Isla, armed with Ethan's research, knew the numbers behind his slides weren't as solid as he claimed. She kept her expression neutral, letting him bask in his moment, because she knew what was coming. When the MC thanked him and invited Isla to the stage, the energy in the room shifted. She walked up with confidence, her sapphire sheath dress catching the light, the microphone steady in her hand. "Good afternoon," she began. "When I started my career in design, I thought success meant creating beautiful spaces for people who could afford them. But over the past year, I've learned that real success is about creating spaces for people who need them most." She spoke about her new initiative with Cross Global, transforming unused urban lots into sustainable, affordable housing communities. She outlined the funding model, the partnerships with local governments, the transparency of every dollar spent. Then she paused, letting her gaze sweep the room. Now, in any industry, transparency is key. Investors deserve to know exactly where their money is going, and communities deserve to trust the people building their homes. She let the words hang for a moment. Unfortunately, we've seen too many examples lately of developers overpromising, underdelivering, or concealing financial risks from their backers. That's why our initiative will publish quarterly reports accessible to both investors and the public. So there are no surprises. It was a direct hit, subtle enough to maintain professionalism, but sharp enough for anyone in the know to recognize. A murmur rippled through the crowd. In the corner of her eye, she saw Grayson's jaw tighten. She closed with a call to action, inviting investors to join a project that would not only stand but stand for something. The applause was immediate and strong, stronger than Grayson's had been. As she stepped down, several investors moved toward her, eager to exchange cards. Among them was a man who had been at Grayson's table earlier. He took her hand warmly. "Impressive presentation, Miss Bennett. I'd like to hear more about your project. I'm reconsidering where I put my capital this quarter." Grayson was still across the room, watching. His expression was unreadable, but his posture had changed, shoulders stiffer, eyes harder. Later, during the networking reception, Ela was speaking with a small group when Grayson finally approached. His voice was low enough for only her to hear. "That was cute, using your speech to take shots at me." She turned to face him fully. "That wasn't about you, Grayson, but if the shoe fits." His eyes narrowed. "You think you've won something here?" She smiled. "Not yet, but I will, because the difference between us is I don't have to lie to get there." For a moment, he said nothing. Then he stepped back, giving her a tight, almost reluctant nod. "You've changed," he said again, just like he had at her apartment. "No," she replied softly. "I just stopped letting you write my story." Ethan appeared at her side then, his presence solid and reassuring. "Everything all right here?" "Perfect," Ela said, turning back to the group she'd been speaking with. As the evening wound down, she and Ethan left together. On the way out, she caught one last glimpse of Grayson standing alone, his conversation partners gone, his smile gone with them. And for the first time, she realized he wasn't just losing control of her. He was losing control of the image he'd built his entire life around. 3 weeks after the Midtown Property Developer Summit, the fallout began. It started as a whisper, investors quietly pulling back from Grayson's high-rise project, citing due diligence concerns. Then a local business journal published a short piece about unverified financial discrepancies in his filings. Within days, the story was everywhere. Ela didn't have to move a finger. The truth had simply done what the truth always does. It surfaced. And this time, there was no one left for Grayson to charm or intimidate into silence. She heard from mutual acquaintances that Serafina had ended their engagement. The breakup wasn't public at first. But then she was photographed at an art gala with a new date, and the tabloids filled in the blanks. Grayson stopped showing up at the usual social events. His name slipped from conversations. For a man who had built his identity on being visible, disappearing was its own kind of exile. Ela, on the other hand, was more visible than ever, but on her own terms. The affordable housing initiative she'd presented at the summit gained momentum faster than she'd dared to hope. Ethan's backing had opened doors, but it was her vision and her work that won over partners and community leaders. She was in meetings almost daily, speaking to city councils, visiting construction sites, reviewing design prototypes. One crisp Friday morning, she stood on a rooftop in Brooklyn, overlooking the frame of the first building in their project. Workers moved like clockwork below, welding, measuring, laying the bones of what would soon be homes for families who had been waiting years for stability. "This is yours," Ethan said quietly, standing beside her. "Ours," she corrected. Then, after a moment, "But yes, it feels like mine too. Really mine." Ethan smiled. "When we first met, I saw this in you. Not just the talent, but the fight. The way you've handled everything with Grayson, it's proof you can stand in any room and own it." She looked at him, the wind tugging at her hair. "I couldn't have done it without you." "You could have," he said simply. "You just didn't have to." That night, there was a celebration dinner at Delancey's for the project's core team. Lila was there, toasting Ila's courage and cracking jokes that made everyone laugh. The atmosphere was warm, full of clinking glasses and shared pride. Halfway through the evening, Ethan took her hand under the table. "I have something for you," he said. She raised a brow. "Should I be nervous?" He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. "Not that kind of something," he added with a smirk. Inside was a silver key with a delicate inscription. Our beginning is wherever you want it to be. It's to the townhouse in Chelsea, he said. Not because I expect you to move in tomorrow, but because I want you to know the door's always open. No conditions, no timelines, just us when you're ready. She closed the box, her fingers brushing his. That's the best gift anyone's ever given me. A week later, the city paper ran a profile on her. From divorce to development, Isla Bennett's bold new chapter. The piece covered her work, her vision, and her resilience. They didn't even mention Grayson by name, though the subtext was obvious. For once, her story wasn't tied to his, it was entirely her own. Still, fate had one last scene to play out. One afternoon as she left a meeting downtown, she spotted him across the street. Grayson. He was alone, in a plain gray suit that looked a little too big on him, talking to no one in particular. He saw her and hesitated, like he wasn't sure whether to approach. Finally, he crossed the street. Isla. She met his gaze, calm. Grayson. There was no smirk this time, no glint of superiority. I guess congratulations are in order, he said, nodding toward the direction of her project's offices. Thank you, she said. He shifted, hands in his pockets. You did well. It wasn't much, but she knew for him, it was the closest he'd ever come to an apology. Take care of yourself, Grayson, she said, and meant it. Not because she wanted him back in her life, but because she no longer needed to hold on to any bitterness. That chapter was closed. She walked away without looking back. Months later, the first families moved into the Brooklyn building. Isla stood at the entrance with Ethan and the project team, handing over keys, hugging mothers, kneeling to greet shy children. Reporters were there, cameras flashing, but for once she didn't care about the headlines. The real story was in the faces around her, faces lit with hope and relief. That evening, she and Ethan went back to the Chelsea townhouse. They sat on the balcony with glasses of wine, the city stretching out below. You know, she said, if you'd told me a year ago this would be my life, I wouldn't have believed you. He smiled. Then I'm glad we didn't waste time telling you. We just built it. She laughed, leaning her head on his shoulder. For the first time in a long time, the future didn't feel like something she had to brace herself for. It felt like something she could run toward. Because she'd learned the most important lesson of all. When you take back your power, no one can write your ending for you. You get to write it yourself. So there it is. That's the end, my friends. The story has come full circle. And if you're still here with me right now, maybe that means something in this journey has touched you. Maybe it reminded you of a moment when you stood up for yourself. Or maybe, deep down, it whispered a truth you've longed to hear. Your past does not get to decide your future. Isla's journey wasn't just about winning against Grayson. It was about winning herself back. She went from someone who waited for permission to speak, to someone who owned the room, the stage, and her entire life. That's something all of us can carry with us. There's a Stoic saying, you have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. That's exactly what Isla learned. She couldn't stop Grayson from trying to hurt her, but she could control how she responded. And in doing so, she completely changed the game. Sometimes we think healing means forgetting the pain. But healing isn't erasing, it's reclaiming. It's walking into a room where someone once made you feel small, and realizing they can't touch you anymore. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "The best revenge is not to be like your enemy." And that was Isla's true victory, living a bigger, freer, happier life than the one her ex ever tried to define for her. So if you've ever been weighed down by someone else's judgment, let this be your reminder. You don't need their approval. You don't need their permission. The life you want to live, you can start building it today. If this story has given you even a spark of courage, hit the like button, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so we can keep telling stories that remind you of your own strength. Because your story isn't over. And like Isla, you will write the next chapter. So there it is. That's the end, my friends. The story has come full circle. And if you're still here with me right now, maybe that means something in this journey has touched you. Maybe it reminded you of a moment when you stood up for yourself. Or maybe, deep down, it whispered a truth you've longed to hear. Your past does not get to decide your future. Isla's journey wasn't just about winning against Grayson. It was about winning herself back. She went from someone who waited for permission to speak to someone who owned the room, the stage, and her entire life. That's something all of us can carry with us. There's a Stoic saying, you have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. That's exactly what Isla learned. She couldn't stop Grayson from trying to hurt her, but she could control how she responded, and in doing so, she completely changed the game. Sometimes we think healing means forgetting the pain, but healing isn't erasing, it's reclaiming. It's walking into a room where someone once made you feel small, and realizing they can't touch you anymore. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "The best revenge is not to be like your enemy." And that was Isla's true victory, living a bigger, freer, happier life than the one her ex ever tried to define for her. So if you've ever been weighed down by someone else's judgment, let this be your reminder. You don't need their approval. You don't need their permission. The life you want to live, you can start building it today. If this story has given you even a spark of courage, hit the like button, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so we can keep telling stories that remind you of your own strength, because your story isn't over. And like Ayla, you will write the next chapter. Grayson Hale had always believed in two things: that winning was everything, and that appearances were half the battle. In his world, perception wasn't just important, it was currency. And for years, he'd built his fortune and his reputation on carefully crafted illusions. From the outside, Grayson was the textbook definition of success. At 38, he was a self-made millionaire in New York's fiercely competitive real estate market. He had the broad shoulders and tailored suits of a man who understood power, the smirk of someone who thought he'd earned the right to it. His name carried weight in certain circles, not because of raw wealth alone, but because he knew how to manipulate a room, how to turn charm into leverage, and how to make people believe they needed him. But behind closed doors, Grayson was a man who measured worth in domination. He didn't just want to win, he wanted others to lose, preferably in a way that reminded them who had beaten them. His relationships, both personal and professional, followed that same logic. When he first met Ayla, she had been different from the women he usually pursued. She wasn't chasing his money or hanging on his every word. She had her own career, her own ambitions, her own light. That intrigued him, at first. But over time, that same independence started to grate on him. He wanted a partner who reflected his success back at him, not one who dared to have a spotlight of her own. So he chipped away at her confidence, slowly, methodically. He'd make subtle comments about her work being cute, or just a hobby, suggest she didn't need to waste her time with clients when she could be by his side. He masked control as care, turning their marriage into a stage where he played the lead and she played the silent supporting role. When Serafina Lane appeared in his life, she was everything Ayla no longer was, at least in his mind. Serafina was loud where Ayla was quiet, bold where Ayla was measured. She played the role of adoring partner without hesitation, never challenging him, never questioning his decisions. She was younger, more malleable, easier to mold into the image he wanted on his arm at every event. The affair began as a game, but once Grayson decided to replace Ayla, he didn't waste time. He made sure the divorce was fast and public, framing it as a mutual decision. In private, he reveled in the whispers, in the way people looked at Serafina and assumed he had upgraded. He told himself Isla would fade into obscurity, maybe even regret losing him. In the months after the divorce, Grayson doubled down on his social image. He brought Serafina to high-profile events, secured magazine features about their whirlwind romance, and positioned himself as a man thriving after heartbreak. It was all part of the brand, which was why tonight mattered so much. The Winter's Grace Gala wasn't just another charity function. It was a stage for power players. The press coverage alone was worth more than most ad campaigns, and Grayson had planned this evening meticulously, from Serafina's dress to the guest list he'd subtly influenced. He had envisioned walking into the ballroom as the undisputed center of attention, shaking hands, making deals, posing for photos with his fiancée. Every detail was meant to reinforce the story he'd been selling, that he was a man at the peak of his game, untouchable and enviable. But then Usla walked in with Ethan Cross, and the script shattered. Grayson knew Ethan's name. Everyone in the industry did. Ethan wasn't just wealthy, he was on a different plane entirely. His investments spanned continents, his companies dominated markets, and yet he managed to stay almost completely out of the gossip pages. When Ethan showed up somewhere, it meant something. And tonight, he was here. With Isla. That fact alone was enough to make Grayson's stomach knot. But what made it worse, what twisted the knife, was the way Isla looked. She wasn't the fragile woman he remembered from the end of their marriage. She wasn't the quiet shadow trailing behind him. She was standing in that ballroom with the kind of self-possession he'd spent years trying to strip away. Serafina sensed the shift immediately. "You didn't tell me your ex would be here," she murmured, her voice low but edged with accusation. "She's not important," Grayson said through clenched teeth, forcing a smile for the benefit of the nearby guests. "She's just trying to make an appearance. Let her have her moment." But deep down, he knew it was more than that. The way people were looking at Isla, the way conversations shifted as she passed, it wasn't pity, it was respect, interest, and worst of all, it was pulling the spotlight away from him. Throughout the first hour of the gala, Grayson tried to regain control. He laughed louder, told bigger stories, made sure to introduce Serafina to influential guests. But every time he glanced toward Isla's table, he saw her engaged in conversation with people who mattered. Ethan was beside her, calm and unreadable, like a man who didn't need to prove anything. That contrast made Grayson's efforts look desperate by comparison. It wasn't just a social blow, it was a direct threat to his image. Grayson's mind churned with ways to turn the night back in his favor. Maybe he could secure a last-minute speech, make a show of pledging a massive donation. Maybe he could drop a strategic comment about Isla's past, something to remind people she wasn't always this polished. He'd built an entire career on controlling narratives, and he wasn't about to let this one slip. Serafina, for her part, tried to keep him focused. "You're overthinking it," she said, sipping her champagne. "She's just here with some guy. You're the one hosting this table. Everyone's here for you." But Grayson knew better. The unspoken rule in their world was simple. Whoever commanded the room's attention was the real winner. And right now, Isla and Ethan had it all. He caught himself staring at her again. She laughed at something Ethan said, the sound light but confident. It wasn't the laugh he remembered from their marriage, the one that had been careful, measured, almost apologetic. This was freer, stronger, and for the first time since the divorce, a thought crept in that Grayson couldn't shake. Maybe he'd underestimated her. The idea made him restless. He'd spent months crafting the narrative that he had moved on to something better. But tonight, in the unforgiving light of the Astoria Grand, he was starting to realize that the person who had truly upgraded might not be him at all. And the more he thought about it, the more he knew. He wasn't just facing an ex-wife tonight. He was facing a rival who had no intention of playing by his rules. The evening was designed to glide without friction. Champagne bubbles, polite applause, and the gentle hum of networking. But under the glittering chandeliers of the Astoria Grand, tension had begun to coil tight, invisible to most but impossible for Grayson to ignore. The silent auction was in full swing, guests scribbling their bids for luxury getaways and priceless art. On the stage, the MC announced the latest item, a week-long stay at a private island resort in the Seychelles, complete with a chef and personal concierge. The starting bid was already high enough to make most attendees blink. Grayson saw his chance. If he could make a show of outbidding everyone, it would shift the narrative. He imagined the cameras catching his confident smile, Serafina clinging to his arm, the crowd murmuring about his generosity. It would be a neat little reclaiming of the spotlight. He raised his hand. 100,000. There was a ripple of polite applause. The MC's eyes lit up. "Thank you, Mr. Hale. 100,000. Do I hear 120? Grayson waited, certain no one would bite. Then, from across the room, a calm voice spoke. 150. The crowd turned. Ethan Cross sat beside Isla, his posture relaxed, his tone unhurried. He hadn't even looked up from his conversation with the older gentleman next to him when he placed the bid. The MC's grin widened. 150? Thank you, Mr. Cross. Do I hear 175? Grayson's jaw tightened. 200. The applause grew. A few people exchanged knowing smiles. Everyone loved a bidding war. Ethan didn't hesitate. 250. This time, the reaction was bigger. Gasps, laughter, murmured bets about how high it would go. Grayson's pulse quickened. He wasn't just fighting for the prize now, he was fighting for pride. 300,000. Ethan finally looked up, his gaze meeting Grayson's across the ballroom. It was a steady, almost bored look, the kind that said this wasn't a contest for him. Then, with a slight tilt of his head, he said, 500,000. The room erupted. Cameras flashed. The MC looked like he'd won the lottery. Grayson could feel every eye on him, waiting to see if he'd push further. But the truth was, he couldn't. Not without making a very public dent in his liquidity. And the last thing he needed was the rumor mill speculating about his finances. Going once, going twice, sold to Mr. Ethan Cross. The applause that followed felt like a spotlight burning into Grayson's skin. Ethan didn't even look triumphant. He simply turned back to Isla, who smiled at him like the rest of the room didn't exist. Grayson's plan had backfired spectacularly. Instead of reclaiming the stage, he'd walked right into a moment that made Ethan look like the generous, unflappable hero, and Isla, the queen, at his side. Serafina tried to smooth it over. "It's just one auction," she whispered, but her tone lacked conviction. Before Grayson could respond, the MC continued. "And now, ladies and gentlemen, we'd like to invite our platinum benefactors to say a few words about why this cause matters to them. Mr. Cross, Ms. Bennett, would you join us on stage?" The crowd clapped as Isla and Ethan stood. Grayson felt a hot wave of humiliation. That was supposed to be him up there, not her. Isla walked onto the stage with effortless grace, her emerald gown pooling at her feet like liquid silk. She took the microphone from the MC, her voice clear but warm. "I've seen firsthand how access to books and safe learning spaces can change a child's future," she began. "I grew up in a small apartment in Queens. My mother worked 2 jobs to keep the lights on, but she always found time to take me to the library. That's where I learned that the world was bigger than the few blocks I lived on. Tonight's donations aren't just numbers. They're opportunities. They're hope. And I'm proud to support that." The applause was genuine, almost thunderous. Ethan spoke briefly after her, praising the organization's work and pledging ongoing support. When they stepped down from the stage, several high-profile guests approached to thank them personally. The press swarmed, snapping photos and asking questions, and that's when it happened. Grayson, unable to stand it any longer, strode toward them. His smile was sharp, but his eyes were cold. "Well," he said loudly enough for the nearby cameras to hear, "you clean up well, Isla. Guess you finally learned how to dress for the room." The remark was a calculated dig, subtle enough to pass as banter, but with an undercurrent only Isla would fully recognize. A few people chuckled awkwardly, unsure if they'd just witnessed a joke or an insult. Isla's gaze didn't waver. "I suppose I did," she said evenly. "Of course, some of us had to learn how to be comfortable in our own skin without needing the room's approval." There was a beat of silence, and then a ripple of laughter. Not the mocking kind, but the appreciative kind. The kind that said they knew exactly what she meant. Grayson's smile faltered. "Enjoy your night," he said, and turned away before anyone could see the flush creeping up his neck. But the damage was done. The exchange had been brief, but it was enough for the crowd to sense the undercurrent. Whispers began to circulate, some about Grayson's obvious discomfort, others about Isla's poise. Back at their table, Ethan leaned close to her. "You didn't have to answer him," he murmured. "Yes," Isla said softly. "I did." Ethan smiled faintly, like he understood exactly what she meant. Across the room, Grayson poured himself another glass of champagne, but the taste was bitter. He'd come here expecting to flaunt his new life and watch his ex-wife shrink in the shadows. Instead, she'd stood in the light, and he couldn't seem to drag her out of it. And deep down, Grayson knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. For the rest of the gala, Isla maintained her composure. She smiled when spoken to, accepted compliments gracefully, and kept her focus on the cause they were there to support. But beneath the polished surface, something was shifting. Grayson's jab, subtle as it was, had found its way under her skin. Not because she believed it, but because it reminded her of every moment in their marriage when he'd made her feel small. She thought she'd buried those memories. The nights she'd stayed up late reworking designs he'd called amateur, only to have him dismiss them again. The dinners where she'd sat silently while he told stories about his successes, omitting her contributions entirely. The way he'd made her feel like her worth was conditional, always dangling just out of reach. Now, here she was, in a gown that cost more than her rent used to be, on the arm of a man whose wealth made Grayson's look like pocket change. And still, a single sentence had made her heart clench. Ethan noticed. Back at their table, between conversations, he leaned in. "You're quiet," he said gently. "Just tired," she lied. Ethan studied her for a moment, clearly unconvinced, but he didn't press. Instead, he placed his hand over hers, a quiet, grounding gesture. She managed a small smile, but her thoughts were already drifting inward. By the time the final speech ended and the last toast was made, Ela was ready to leave. Outside, the cold night air wrapped around her like a wake-up call. Ethan's driver pulled up, and they slid into the back seat of the sleek black sedan. Ethan didn't speak right away. He simply reached into the console, poured her a glass of sparkling water, and handed it over. "You handled yourself well tonight," he said. "Did I?" she asked, staring out at the blur of city lights. "You did more than that. You owned the room." But she didn't feel like she'd owned anything. She felt invaded, like Grayson had found a crack in her armor and pressed just hard enough to remind her it was there. At her apartment, Ethan walked her to the door. "Are you sure you're all right?" "I'm fine," she said, then added, "Thank you for tonight." She kissed him lightly and disappeared inside before he could see the doubt lingering in her eyes. The moment the door closed, the silence hit her. She slipped off her heels and padded to the small living room, the hem of her gown trailing behind her. Her apartment was beautiful in its own way, warm, filled with pieces she loved, nothing ostentatious. But it was also quiet. Too quiet. She poured herself a glass of wine and sat on the couch, replaying the evening in her head. She could still hear Grayson's voice, still feel the sting of that calculated remark. She hated that he still had the power to make her question herself, even for a moment. It wasn't just about him. It was about the years she'd spent believing she wasn't enough, about the part of her that still measured her worth against someone else's approval. Her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "Nice performance tonight. Too bad I know the real you." Her stomach dropped. Another buzz, another message. "Maybe Ethan should know a few things before he invests too much in you." She knew exactly who it was from. Grayson had always been subtle in public, but in private, he could be ruthless. He must have gotten her number from a mutual contact, or maybe he'd kept it all along. She stared at the screen, her mind racing. He couldn't actually have anything to use against her. Could he? She'd never done anything illegal, never cheated, never lied about her background. But she also knew that in their world, truth was often less important than perception. All it would take was the right rumor in the right ear to cause damage. For the first time in months, she felt that old helplessness creeping back, the feeling of being trapped in someone else's narrative. She barely slept that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she imagined Grayson feeding lies to the press, planting doubts in Ethan's mind, finding new ways to undermine her. She knew she couldn't ignore it, but she also knew that confronting him would only give him more satisfaction. The next morning, her fears took a sharper edge. She opened her email to find 3 messages from past clients, each asking about something they'd heard regarding her work. No one would say exactly what, but the implication was clear. Someone was spreading rumors. She paced her apartment, trying to think of a way to get ahead of it. Part of her wanted to call Ethan and tell him everything, but another part hesitated. She didn't want to seem paranoid or, worse, like she couldn't handle her own battles. Around noon, her phone rang. Ethan's name lit up the screen. She answered, trying to sound normal. "Hey," he said. "I was thinking, lunch at Delancey's? My treat." She hesitated. "I can't today. I've got some work to catch up on." "All right," he said slowly. "But if something's wrong, you know you can tell me." "I know," she said, but her voice was thin. When the call ended, she sat at her desk and buried herself in work, but her mind kept circling back to the same thought. She'd come so far, rebuilt so much, and yet one man's malice still had the power to shake her. By evening, the anxiety had hardened into determination. She wasn't going to let Grayson undo what she'd built. Not this time. But the truth was, she didn't yet know how to stop him. And as she poured herself another glass of wine, the city lights flickering outside her window, she realized something else. This wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about ending his hold on her. Permanently. The morning after her sleepless night, Isla woke to the faint vibration of her phone on the nightstand. For a moment, she braced herself for another hostile message. But this time it was a call from Ethan. "Good morning," he said, his voice warm but with an undertone of purpose. "Can you meet me at my office? There's something I want to show you." She hesitated. "Is everything all right?" "Better than all right," he said. "Trust me." By the time she arrived at Cross Global's headquarters, a sleek, glass-walled building that seemed to rise straight into the clouds, her curiosity had shifted into a low hum of unease. The receptionist greeted her by name and directed her to the top floor. Ethan's office was exactly what she expected. Minimalist, expansive, with a panoramic view of the city. But what caught her attention wasn't the view, it was the thick folder sitting on his desk. He gestured for her to sit. "I know something's been bothering you since the gala," he began. "You didn't have to say it. I could see it, so I did some digging." Her chest tightened. "Digging?" He opened the folder and slid a series of printed emails toward her. "Grayson's been busy. I have friends in media and real estate who flagged these. He's been planting stories, questioning your professional reputation, implying you landed certain clients by less than honest means." Isla scanned the pages, each line twisting her stomach tighter. The rumors were subtle enough to sound like insider gossip, but damaging enough to cause doubt. He'd even thrown in hints about her relationship with Ethan, framing it like a calculated move on her part. Her voice wavered. "I thought maybe he'd start something, but this is worse than I imagined." Ethan leaned forward. "What he doesn't know is that I've also been looking into him." She blinked. "Why?" "Because I protect the people I care about," he said simply. Then he slid another stack of documents toward her. Bank statements, internal memos, emails. "Grayson's been making some very risky investments. Several of his developments are over-leveraged, and he's taken money from investors he can't afford to cross. If certain facts were to come to light, his empire would start to crumble." Isla stared at the papers. "How did you get all this?" Ethan gave a faint smile. "Let's just say I have a good legal team. Everything here is public record. You just have to know where to look, and I know exactly where." Her mind raced. "So, you're saying I could turn this on him?" "I'm saying," Ethan replied, "that you don't have to be on the defensive anymore. You have the upper hand. If he keeps pushing, we can make sure certain truths reach the right people. Or—" He paused, his eyes steady on hers. "You can confront him directly and give him a choice." For a long moment, Isla didn't speak. She thought about the years she'd spent feeling powerless, about the months of careful rebuilding since the divorce. The temptation to hit back, hard, was almost intoxicating. But a part of her hesitated. "If I do this," she said slowly, "I want it to be about protecting what I've built, not just revenge." Ethan nodded. "Then make it clear. Draw the line and let him decide how this ends." By the time she left the office, her decision was made. That evening, she sent a short, direct message to Grayson. "We need to talk. My place. 8 p.m., he replied within minutes. "Finally coming to your senses? I'll be there." At exactly 8, the knock came. Grayson walked in like he owned the space, his cologne arriving a split second before his smirk. "Nice place," he said, scanning the apartment with faux interest. "Ethan's taste, I assume?" "No," Isla said evenly. "Mine. Sit down." He chuckled but obliged, sinking into the chair opposite her. "So what's this about? Realized you can't keep up in my world without a little help?" She opened the folder Ethan had given her and slid it across the table. "It's about this." Grayson glanced at the papers, his smirk fading slightly. "What is this?" "Proof," she said, her voice steady. "Proof that you've been spreading lies about me. And proof that your business isn't as untouchable as you'd like people to believe." He looked up sharply. "You've been spying on me?" "No," she said. "I've been protecting myself. You've been trying to damage my reputation, Grayson. But here's the thing, you're not the only one who knows people." His jaw tightened. "You think you can threaten me?" "This isn't a threat," she said calmly. "It's a choice. You stop talking about me. You stop interfering with my life, and I keep what I know between us. You keep going, and well, the investors you've been lying to might be very interested in some of these details. For a moment, the only sound was the faint ticking of the clock on her wall. Then Grayson leaned back, forcing a laugh. You wouldn't. You're not built for that kind of fight. Isla met his gaze, unflinching. Maybe I wasn't before, but I am now. The silence stretched. Grayson's smirk wavered, replaced by something harder to read. Calculation, maybe even uncertainty. Finally, he stood. You've changed, he said. No, Isla replied. I've just stopped letting you decide who I am. He left without another word, but she knew this wasn't over. Still, for the first time, she felt like she wasn't just reacting, she was in control. When Ethan called later to ask how it went, she told him the truth. I don't think he'll try anything immediately, but I also don't think he's used to losing. This might just make him more desperate. Then we'll be ready, Ethan said. And this time, you won't be standing alone. And in that moment, Isla realized something powerful. Grayson might have been her past, but he would never be her future again. Winter frost sparkled outside the Astoria Grand, every breath a visible ghost drifting into the night. Inside, the grand ballroom blazed under chandeliers, each crystal catching light like frozen fireworks. Cameras flashed from every corner, eager to capture the parade of wealth and beauty. For Grayson Hale, this was his kingdom, a realm of silk gowns, glittering jewels, and whispered deals over champagne. And tonight, he would parade his newest prize before the world. At his side was Serafina Lane, the fiancée he'd been showing off in society circles for months. She was 26, a rising star in fashion PR, all endless legs and an instinct for curling into Grayson as if she'd been born for the role. She wore a backless silver gown that shimmered like liquid mercury, the kind of dress that made people stare and whisper they wouldn't dare touch. Grayson loved those stares, loved the envy. As they stepped onto the red carpet leading into the ballroom, reporters swarmed. Grayson, Serafina, over here! Is this the engagement party before the wedding? Grayson offered a polished half-smile, perfected in boardrooms and magazine covers, then leaned toward Serafina, just loud enough for the microphones to catch. Enjoy it, darling. Everyone here wishes they were you. He didn't say aloud who he was really thinking about, his ex-wife, Isla Bennett. She had once stood beside him at events like this, a quiet beauty who never fought for the spotlight. That had been her problem, he told himself. She didn't know how to shine. She didn't know how to make him shine brighter. So he'd replaced her with someone younger, bolder, someone who could. Grayson had heard rumors about Isla since the divorce. Some said she'd left the city. Others claimed she'd gone broke, forced to sell what little she had. A few whispered she was working at some design firm just to get by. The thought amused him. Let her see this. Let her see what she'd lost. Let her choke on it. The ballroom doors opened to a scene straight from a society magazine. Champagne silk tablecloths, crystal vases spilling with white orchids and roses, and a string quartet playing softly in the corner. Waiters floated past with foie gras and vintage Dom Perignon. This was the annual Winter's Grace Charity Gala, where CEOs mingled with movie stars and old money waltzed with new. Grayson and Serafina moved to the center of the room, greeting a cluster of investors. His laugh rang out, his gestures expansive. He spoke of their upcoming wedding, a Maldives honeymoon, and how Serafina was the missing piece in his life. All the while, his eyes kept scanning the crowd, just in case someone was watching. But Isla Bennett wasn't the kind of woman to crash a party anymore. No, she was probably at home in some small apartment, curled up with takeout, maybe scrolling through the pictures that would flood social media tonight. The image made him smile. Across the room, the maitre d' adjusted his tie and glanced toward the main entrance. The heavy glass doors swung open, letting in a rush of cold air. Conversations faltered. Heads began to turn. A woman stepped inside. She wasn't loud. She wore no sequins, no feathers, yet somehow the air stilled around her. Isla Bennett entered the ballroom like a secret the world had just remembered. Her dark emerald silk gown was cut to perfection, the color pulling every shade of green from her eyes until they blazed under the lights. Her hair was swept into an elegant knot, revealing a face calmer, stronger than Grayson remembered. And on her arm was a man every business figure in the country would recognize. though most had never met him, Ethan Cross. The elusive billionaire who had built an empire of titans without ever courting the spotlight. His public appearances were rare, but when he did appear, it was headline news. The reaction was instant, whispers rippling like wind through leaves. Is that Ethan Cross? Who's the woman? Wait, isn't that Grayson Hale's ex-wife? Cameras pivoted toward the doorway, shutters clicking like a drum roll. Ethan's hand rested lightly over Ila's as they walked forward, his expression unreadable but unmistakably protective. Across the ballroom, Grayson's smile froze. For a second, he thought the champagne had gone to his head. His Isla, was supposed to be invisible, weak, forgettable. But she was here, as if she'd stepped off a magazine cover, every move tracked by the crowd, every glance photographed. Serafina's grip tightened on his arm. "Who is that?" she hissed, though her tone made it clear she already knew. The quartet shifted to a new piece, its swelling melody only heightening the tension. Isla and Ethan moved through the room at a deliberate pace, every eye following them. A waiter nearly stumbled offering champagne. Isla accepted a glass with a faint smile, her gaze finally settling on Grayson. There was no malice in her eyes, no desperation. Only quiet acknowledgement, like seeing someone she once knew, nothing more. Heat crept up Grayson's spine. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She should look small next to Serafina. She should fade. Not this. Not walking in with a man whose net worth made Grayson's look like pocket change. The first camera flashes erupted. Ethan leaned toward Isla, murmuring something that made her smile. And that smile hit Grayson harder than any insult could. It was the smile of a woman who no longer cared what he thought. And then it struck him. No one in the room was looking at him anymore. They were all looking at her. That was when Grayson realized. Tonight wasn't his show to steal. It was hers. The moment Isla Bennett stepped into that ballroom, it was as if her past and present collided in one blinding flash of light. To the crowd, she was a vision of elegance, the kind of woman who seemed born to glide through a room full of power and wealth. But to Isla, this night was something else entirely. It was the culmination of a year of rebuilding herself from the ground up. 1 year ago, she had been a different woman. Back then, Isla had been Mrs. Grayson Hale, the dutiful wife of a rising real estate mogul. Her days were filled with managing their penthouse, hosting dinners for Grayson's business associates, and keeping up appearances at charity events. She was the woman behind the man, the one who made sure the suits were pressed, the wine was chilled, and the smile never faltered, even when her own heart felt like it was breaking. She hadn't grown up in luxury. Isla was the daughter of a single mother who worked 2 jobs to keep food on the table in a small apartment in Queens. From an early age, Isla learned the art of making something beautiful out of nothing, transforming thrift store finds into stylish outfits, turning cramped rooms into warm, inviting spaces. That skill led her into interior design, and by her late 20s, she had built a modest but promising business. That's when she met Grayson. He'd walked into the boutique hotel lobby where Isla was presenting a design pitch, all tailored confidence and easy charm. He praised her work, said he admired her vision, and by the end of the night, they were sharing dinner at a rooftop restaurant overlooking the city lights. Isla had been drawn to him, not just his ambition, but the way he seemed to see her as someone extraordinary. Or so she thought. Within a year, they were married. At first, life with Grayson was intoxicating. They traveled to Europe, dined at Michelin-starred restaurants, and attended events where everyone seemed to know his name. Isla's design business took a back seat. Grayson said she didn't need to work anymore, that she should focus on being the face of their future. She told herself it was love. She told herself it was partnership. But slowly, his compliments turned into criticisms. Her opinions were brushed aside. Decisions were made without her. By the 3rd year of marriage, Isla realized she'd been reduced to an accessory, a beautiful ornament to enhance Grayson's image. The final blow came when she discovered his affair with Serafina Lane. Grayson didn't even bother to deny it. Instead, he framed it as inevitable, claiming they'd grown apart and that Serafina was more aligned with his goals. He made it clear he intended to move on, and quickly. The divorce was brutal, not because Isla fought for his money. She didn't. She walked away with only what was hers, determined to reclaim the parts of herself she'd lost. But the whispers that followed were cruel. People assumed she'd been discarded because she couldn't keep up. They speculated she was struggling financially, that she'd been replaced in every way that mattered. For months, Isla kept to herself. She returned to her design roots, taking on projects quietly, often for clients who valued discretion. She didn't post on social media, didn't attend public events. Instead, she focused on rebuilding her life, this time on her own terms. It was during a private consultation for a luxury penthouse renovation that she met Ethan Cross. Ethan was unlike anyone Isla had ever encountered. On paper, he was a billionaire investor whose portfolio spanned everything from tech startups to luxury resorts. In person, he was surprisingly unassuming, tall, with a quiet confidence and a way of listening that made her feel seen in a way Grayson never had. Their first meeting was strictly professional. He'd been referred to her by a mutual contact who praised her ability to combine elegance with livability. She worked on his project for weeks before anything shifted. Conversations about color palettes and floor plans gradually turned into discussions about books, travel, and life. Ethan had a dry sense of humor that caught her off guard, and he never treated her like someone to be managed or molded. When the project was complete, Ethan insisted she attend the small gathering he was hosting to celebrate. Isla hesitated. By then, she had grown used to avoiding public scenes, but something in his steady gaze convinced her. That night, under the glow of soft jazz and city lights, Ethan asked if he could take her to dinner. Their relationship moved slowly. Ethan wasn't one for grand gestures. His style was quiet support, remembering the details that mattered to her and never once making her feel like she needed to be anyone other than herself. He learned about her past with Grayson, not through gossip, but because Isla told him when she was ready. His only response was, he made the biggest mistake of his life. By the time winter rolled around, Ethan invited Isla to be his guest at the Winter's Grace charity gala. She almost refused, until she learned that Grayson was on the host committee. At first, the thought of being in the same room made her stomach twist. But then she realized something. She wasn't that fragile woman anymore. She didn't need to hide. The emerald gown she chose wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming the way she saw herself. She selected it because it made her feel strong, because when she caught her reflection, she saw the woman she'd fought to become. When she walked into that ballroom on Ethan's arm, it wasn't to make Grayson jealous or to prove anything to the crowd. It was simply because she belonged there, and no one, not even her ex-husband, could take that away from her. Still, when her eyes found Grayson across the room, standing with Serafina in their circle of admirers, she couldn't help but notice the flicker of shock in his expression. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even recognition. It was the dawning realization that she had moved on in ways he never imagined. Ethan leaned toward her, his voice low enough for only her to hear. "You look like you own this place." She smiled, her fingers brushing his. "I don't, but I don't need to." And that was the truth. One Grayson would never understand, because Isla Bennett's worth had never depended on him, and tonight, the entire room was about to see it. The Winter's Grace Charity Gala wasn't just another night in New York's social calendar. It was the night. The event was famous for its exclusivity, with invitations harder to secure than a seat at the Met Gala. For the city's elite, being here wasn't just about giving to charity. It was about being seen, photographed, and whispered about in all the right circles. The Astoria Grand's ballroom was a masterpiece of opulence. Massive crystal chandeliers hung like frozen waterfalls from the vaulted ceiling, scattering light across the room in 1,000 glittering fragments. Tables were dressed in champagne silk, with towering arrangements of white orchids, roses, and sprays of baby's breath. Waiters in crisp black jackets moved like a synchronized dance troupe, balancing trays of caviar-topped blinis and glasses of vintage Dom Perignon. The air was perfumed with a mix of designer scents and the faint aroma of truffle canapés. At the far end of the room, a grand stage was framed by velvet curtains, ready for the night's speeches and the silent auction finale. A baby grand piano gleamed in the corner, where a young musician played soft jazz, each note weaving into the murmur of conversations and the clink of crystal flutes. Isla and Ethan entered just as the room was at its most alive. The lighting, warm and golden, washed over her emerald gown and made the silk shimmer with every step. She could feel eyes turning toward them, some curious, some stunned. Cameras from the press section near the stage shifted their lenses, the quiet click of shutters punctuating the music. Ethan, in a perfectly tailored charcoal tuxedo, looked entirely at ease. His hand rested lightly over hers, a steady anchor in the sea of scrutiny. He wasn't the kind of man to perform for the crowd. His presence alone was enough to command attention. And in a room where most people measured worth by how loudly they could announce it, that made him stand out even more. They were barely halfway to their table when the first wave of whispers reached Ila's ears. "Is that Ethan Cross? I thought he never came to these things." "Who's she?" "Wait, isn't that Grayson Hale's ex?" The buzz spread quickly, like ripples across still water. Isla kept her chin lifted, her smile subtle. She wasn't here to feed the gossip, but she wasn't going to shrink from it either. From across the room, Grayson spotted them. His conversation with a pair of investors faltered mid-sentence. The smile he'd been flashing all night froze, then twitched as he tried to regain control of it. Serafina followed his gaze, her perfectly glossed lips parting in a silent, "Oh." Grayson had expected the evening to be about him, about his engagement, his success, his place among the city's elite. But now the spotlight had shifted, and it wasn't coming back anytime soon. Ethan guided Isla toward a table near the stage, a prime spot reserved for top donors. The event coordinator, a tall woman in a sequined black gown, intercepted them with a beaming smile. "Mr. Cross, Miss Bennett, welcome. We're honored you could join us. Your table is right here." She gestured toward the center, directly in view of the main cameras. Grayson's jaw tightened. That was his territory. He'd always made sure to secure seating close to the stage where his presence couldn't be ignored. Seeing Ila there now in what he considered his domain felt like a personal insult. At their table, Isla recognized a few faces, old acquaintances from her years as Grayson's wife. Some greeted her warmly, others with the kind of polite surprise that thinly veiled deeper curiosity. A woman in a sapphire gown leaned across the table. "Isla, darling, you look radiant. And who is this?" "Ethan Cross," Isla said simply. Ethan nodded politely, offering his hand. The woman's eyes widened slightly as she shook it, her grip tightening like she was holding a piece of gold. "Oh, Ethan Cross. Well, this is quite the surprise." As they settled in, Ila let her gaze drift around the room. The decorations, the music, the murmur of ambition. It was all so familiar. And yet, tonight felt different. She was here on her own merit. Not as someone's plus one, not as the silent supporter in the background. This time, she had nothing to prove and nothing to lose. Across the room, Grayson's voice grew louder, his laughter more forced. He overcompensated, introducing Serafina to every group they approached, making sure to mention their engagement, their upcoming honeymoon, his latest business win. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't draw the crowd's attention back. The master of ceremonies took the stage, tapping the microphone gently. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Winter's Grace Charity Gala. Tonight, we come together to support children's literacy programs across the nation. Your generosity makes a difference in countless lives." As the speech continued, Ila felt Ethan's hand brush hers under the table. She glanced at him, and he gave her a small smile, one that seemed to say, "You're doing just fine." When the MC announced the silent auction items, private island getaways, rare art pieces, exclusive dining experiences, Isla noticed Grayson leaning toward one of the organizers, whispering urgently. Moments later, the organizer moved toward the stage. Isla could guess exactly what Grayson was trying to do. Insert himself into the program, grab the microphone, reclaim the spotlight. But before that could happen, the MC's voice rang out again. "We'd like to give special thanks to our newest platinum benefactor, whose generous donation has already set a record for this event. Please join me in thanking Mr. Ethan Cross and Miss Isla Bennett." A wave of applause swept the room. Isla felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she didn't shrink from it. Ethan gave her hand a reassuring squeeze, then nodded toward the audience as the cameras found them. Grayson's expression darkened. This wasn't just a chance appearance. Isla and Ethan had come prepared. And the fact that they just out-donated him at an event he considered his was a blow he hadn't seen coming. As the applause died down, the MC added, "We're especially grateful that Miss Bennett, a talented interior designer, has offered to design the new Children's Learning Center pro bono." "Thank you, Isla." That detail wasn't just impressive, it was devastating to Grayson. Not only was Isla here with a billionaire, she was here as a contributor in her own right. She wasn't just arm candy, she was part of the reason people were clapping. Grayson's glass of champagne trembled slightly in his hand. Serafina whispered something to him, but he didn't respond. His eyes were locked on Isla, and for the first time all evening his smile was gone. And though the night was far from over, Isla knew one thing. She had already won more than Grayson could ever take back.